before the Krays ruled the East End, another crew was building something just as dangerous across the river. Charlie and Eddie Richardson grew up in Camberwell, South London. Their world wasn't much different from the Krays, working class, tough, and full of rules you didn't learn in school. It was a place where you made your own path, often with your fists. Charlie was sharp. He had a brain for business, even if the business was shady. Eddie was more physical, quieter, but just as dangerous when it mattered. Together, they started small, trading on the black market, stealing, running scams. By the 1950s, they weren't just street kids anymore. They were becoming players. While the Krays were drawing headlines and posing for cameras, the Richardson brothers stayed in the shadows. They didn't care about fame. They cared about control. And in South London, they had it. They ran front companies, scrap metal, used goods, import-export deals. But behind the scenes, it was all about extortion, fraud, and illegal gambling. And if someone crossed them, they didn't just send a warning. They made an example. Their crew was tight, loyal, brutal, and feared. People didn't speak out against the Richardsons, not just because they were scared, but because they knew what could happen if they did. While Ronnie and Reggie Kray were rising fast in the East, Charlie and Eddie were building something just as big in the South. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was ruthless. 2 empires, 1 city, and sooner or later they were going to collide. The Krays called their gang the Firm. The Richardsons didn't bother with fancy names. They just got things done. The difference between them was clear. The Krays loved the spotlight, posing for the press, hanging out with movie stars, turning violence into theater. The Richardsons, they stayed in the background. No suits, no speeches, just business and pain. Charlie Richardson ran things like a company. He didn't see himself as a gangster. He saw himself as a businessman, a boss. He had front companies that looked legitimate, scrap metal yards, import-export firms, even some legal gambling operations. But behind closed doors, it was fraud, loan sharking, racketeering, and torture. Eddie was the quiet one, but his silence wasn't weakness. He was the muscle. If Charlie gave the word, Eddie made sure it happened. No questions, no loose ends. They surrounded themselves with loyal, violent men. Guys like Frankie Fraser, known on the streets as Mad Frankie. He had no problem pulling teeth with pliers or smashing someone's knees in. The Richardsons didn't need to make threats. Their actions spoke for them. They also had something just as important: protection. Corrupt cops, lawyers, and insiders helped them stay one step ahead. Evidence disappeared. Cases collapsed. Victims kept quiet. By the early 60s, the Krays had the East End. The Richardsons had South London. Both crews were untouchable in their own territory. But London wasn't big enough for 2 kings. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. And with every new nightclub, every new deal, the space between them was shrinking. Something had to give. If the Krays ruled with fear, the Richardsons ruled with pain. Real pain. The kind that left scars and silence. They didn't just beat people up. They tortured them. Not in alleyways or dark corners, but in rooms set up for it. Some were called punishment rooms. You walked in. You didn't always walk out the same. Charlie Richardson believed that fear worked best when people knew what could happen. So he made sure they saw it up close. Victims were tied to chairs. Electric wires were clipped to their toes, fingers, or genitals. The power would flow until they screamed, passed out, or confessed. Some had their teeth pulled out with pliers. Others were burned with cigarettes or had toenails ripped out. One man was nailed to a floorboard. Another was forced to drink boiling hot water. It wasn't rage, it was routine. This was the cost of crossing the Richardson Gang. Miss a payment, talk to the wrong person, steal a few pounds. You got the treatment, and they didn't hide it. Members of the gang were often invited to watch. It was a message. Loyalty isn't optional. This is what earned them the nickname the Torture Gang, not just in the papers, but in the streets, in prison yards, in whispers across London. Even the police were shaken by the stories that leaked out, but most victims never reported anything. How could they? If they talked, the next chair might be theirs. The Richardsons weren't in it for revenge. Torture was their business strategy. It kept people in line, kept profits flowing, and kept their names off everyone's lips. For a while, it worked, but that kind of violence always leaves a trail, and eventually, someone followed it. By the mid-1960s, London was divided, east and south, 2 gangs, 2 bosses, and 1 ticking time bomb. The Krays had the East End locked down. The Richardsons ruled the south. For a while, they kept their distance. Each side made money, built networks, and avoided stepping on each other's turf. But London's underworld doesn't work like that forever. The tension started with clubs. Nightclubs were more than places to drink. They were money machines, gambling, loan sharking, drugs, protection. Everyone wanted in, and that meant stepping over invisible lines. In 1966, one of the Krays men tried to muscle into a Soho gambling spot tied to the Richardsons. It didn't go well. Fists flew, knives came out, people disappeared. No arrests, no headlines, just bodies and whispers. From there, things escalated. Reggie Kray and Eddie Richardson began exchanging threats through third parties. Both crews started watching each other's movements. Gunmen were sent into clubs. Cars followed rivals through dark streets. A few men were beaten, stabbed, or never seen again. At the center of it all was George Cornell, a name tied to both gangs. He once worked with the Richardsons, but drifted toward the Krays. That betrayal would later cost him his life. The press got wind of what was happening and started calling it a gangland war. For once, they weren't exaggerating. London wasn't just seeing street fights, it was turning into a cold, calculated battlefield. But while the Krays loved the spotlight, the Richardsons didn't. They wanted control, not chaos. Charlie especially feared that too much noise would bring police pressure. He was right, because while these gangs were circling each other, the law was watching them both, and the first one to slip would fall hard. Everything started to unravel on a warm summer night in 1966. The place, Mr. Smith's nightclub in Catford. It was a known Richardson spot. Money flowed through the doors, and so did secrets. But this time, the wrong people were watching. Police had been building a quiet case against the Richardson Gang. They knew about the torture. They just needed proof. That night they got it. The raid was sudden. Officers stormed in and found more than booze and blackjack tables, hidden rooms, weapons, cash, and something worse, torture tools, wires, pliers, surgical blades, restraints. There were also men willing to talk, some of them terrified and ready to flip. Within days, Charlie Richardson, Frankie Fraser, and others were arrested. Eddie Richardson managed to stay ahead of police for a while, but his time was running out too. The charges were serious: grievous bodily harm, false imprisonment, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to torture. It wasn't just about gang crime anymore. This was brutality laid bare. The 1967 trial was explosive. Witnesses came forward and described torture sessions in chilling detail. One said he was electrocuted until he passed out. Another told how his toenails were pulled out. The courtroom went silent more than once. Charlie sat there stone-faced. Fraser laughed it off, but the jury wasn't impressed. The evidence was too much. The reputation too dark. The verdict, guilty. Charlie got 25 years. Fraser got 10. The rest of the crew were scattered. Some jailed, some vanished. The raid at Mr. Smith's didn't just break a gang. It exposed a level of violence the public hadn't seen before. The myth of untouchable gangsters started to crack. And as South London's empire crumbled, the Krays watched from across the river, thinking they had outlasted their rivals. But their turn was coming too. When the verdicts came down, it was over. The Richardson Gang, the most feared crew in South London, was finished. Charlie Richardson got 25 years. The judge called it one of the worst cases of organized crime he'd ever seen. Charlie didn't flinch. He still claimed it was all exaggerated. that the torture stories were lies told by frightened men looking for deals, but the evidence said otherwise. Frankie Fraser got 10 years. He shrugged it off like jail was just another job. He'd been in and out of prisons his whole life and knew how to survive on the inside. Eddie Richardson, who had dodged arrest during the first wave, was eventually caught and sentenced too. His role as the quiet enforcer didn't buy him any mercy. Once their leaders were locked up, the firm scattered. Some members turned on each other. Others tried to fade into the background. A few disappeared entirely. Charlie spent most of his sentence in maximum security. He kept to himself, studied law, and tried to appeal the case more than once. It didn't work. His name had been burned into the headlines. Torture boss of South London. Fraser used his time in prison to build a reputation, not just as a gangster, but as a character. Loud, defiant, and always ready to tell a story. His way. Eddie stayed quieter, more controlled. When he was eventually released, he didn't jump into interviews. He waited, watched, and planned. The timing of their downfall was almost poetic. Within a year, the Krays were arrested too. The East and South both fell. Two empires gone within months of each other. London's gangland era had come to a sudden bloody end. The city moved on, but the stories, the fear, they stuck around. Because some names never really disappear. When Charlie Richardson walked out of prison in 1984, after serving 18 years, he didn't look like a gangster anymore. He looked like a businessman. Older, sharper, quieter. He said he was done with crime. He wanted a fresh start, but clean breaks are rare in that world. He tried going legit, got involved in property, international deals, even tried some political connections, but shady business followed him. In 1990, he was arrested again for fraud and conspiracy in a new financial scam. He served more time. That second fall crushed any real comeback. Frankie Fraser, on the other hand, embraced the legend. He became a full-blown media figure, wrote books, gave interviews, and even appeared on TV. He told stories about torture like they were jokes, like it was just part of the job. People called him entertaining. Some called him sick. Either way, he didn't care. Fraser leaned into the fame. He turned pain into profit. Tourists paid to walk the streets with him. Fans sent letters. True crime shows loved him. Eddie Richardson eventually spoke too, but in a different way. He published an autobiography in the early 2000s. In it, he denied most of the torture claims and painted a more calculated, cleaner image of the firm. He blamed the media for twisting everything. He stayed away from the spotlight otherwise. No tours, no shows. The public, though, wasn't sure what to believe. Some saw them as relics from a brutal time. Others saw them as survivors who played the game and lost. A few, especially in South London, still spoke their names with a mix of fear and respect. But behind the stories, the interviews and the books, there were still scars. Families who never got answers. Victims who never got justice. And a legacy that refused to fade quietly. The Krays got the fame. The Richardsons got the fear. To this day, when old-school Londoners talk about the underworld, they'll tell you the Richardsons were worse, not louder, not more famous, just more brutal. They didn't pose for cameras. They didn't chase headlines. They built their empire quietly through torture and intimidation. And they ran it like a business, efficient, organized and ruthless. Their name never became as commercial as the Krays. You won't see their faces on t-shirts or posters. There are fewer films, fewer fans, but among criminals, their reputation still carries weight. The methods they used, violence as discipline, fear as structure, became a blueprint. Later gangs, especially in South London, copied the formula. Tight crews, brutal punishment, loyalty above all else. Some of that DNA still exists in gang culture today. What's left of their empire? Nothing concrete. The businesses, the clubs, the money, it's all gone. But their story lives on in books, podcasts, and whispered conversations in old pubs. Charlie died in 2012. Fraser passed in 2014. Eddie is still alive, but out of sight. The public remains divided. Were they cold-blooded criminals or products of a ruthless time? Were the torture stories exaggerated, or worse than we'll ever know? One thing's certain, they changed how crime worked in London. They showed that you didn't need celebrity to control a city. You just needed fear and enough silence to keep it going. The Richardsons never wanted to be loved. They wanted to be obeyed. And in their corner of London, for a long time they were.